Double Helix released a new Strider game recently, and I'm genuinely impressed with the game. They took the concepts of the Strider series and applied it to the Metroidvania game model quite well, allowing for the kind of exploratory freedom that the Strider character concept was designed for. However, one thing kept bugging me in the back of my mind: the game felt unusually linear for the kind of interconnected world that Double Helix described. This is something I've noticed becoming quite prevalent in the Metroidvania genre, the illusion of freedom. Many games that tout the benefit of having an interconnected world, often referred to as a Metroidvania, wind up being surprisingly linear, which ends up leaving a bad taste in my mouth. This problem is becoming so prevalent that I feel the need to discuss the concepts of a Metroidvania and try to clear the air between the illusion of freedom and true exploratory freedom in the genre. First off, let's establish some basic knowledge and terminology about the topics at hand. The Metroidvania is a very loose, unofficial category of games, typically attributed by non-linear progression and gated areas. Progress is often impeded by the necessity of key items, whether it be a power-up, a literal key, or plot in a worst-case scenario. The non-linear aspects of the genre are often marked by interconnected level designs and alluring alcoves that often require a new item or some mad platforming skills. The genre was established from the mishmash of Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night, the first set of widely popular games that established this model. Oftentimes, a Metroidvania will have the capacity to sequence break, allowing players to make their own path through the game and subvert many plot segments that might be considered slow or boring. Sequence breaks aren't mandatory for a Metroidvania, but it usually is the mark of a good one since it promotes skill-based exploration. Metroidvanias, for the most part, were a very quiet and unobserved game model, but lately games have been praised for, or even tout the idea that they're a Metroidvania. This problem somewhat started with the rampant popularity of Cave Story, which we'll discuss later. Many modern games touting this genre fall into a design philosophy I call illusion of freedom, where you present a vast world but still manage to railroad the player through certain means. While one of the usual trademarks of a Metroidvania is the concept of impeded progress, oftentimes these games will be overly restrictive with your exploratory freedom. Levels will either not let you do any exploring without a power-up, or you cannot progress the game unless you fulfill a certain requirement. These kinds of elements are inherently paradoxical to the genre since you can't offer non-linear game design yet force people to play the game in a specific manner. This is typically what I mean when I say illusion of freedom, the idea that exploration is there, but you can't have it just yet. You gotta wait. True freedom in a Metroidvania game is something really hard to establish, since it oftentimes requires a hefty time investment in level design and mechanics. The concept of designing a game to be loosely restrictive yet gives experienced players pure freedom is something many Metroidvanias strive for but rarely achieve. There are some examples of games with true freedom, however, one of which I hold really close to my heart. The La-Mulana remake is a cult classic among fans of the Metroidvania genre for how well its game is designed. The game presents 16 levels with a head-crushing amount of interconnected paths, non-essential power-ups, and puzzles meant to stop new players in their tracks. The beauty of La-Mulana, however, is that it doesn't force you into a specific path or overly bar your progress. There are only 3 mandatory things to do to progress the game: get the double jump, defeat Vi since he blocks the level and a plot segment, and chant the mantras. Aside from those things, you as the player have pure freedom to explore however you wish. The game's first dungeon can drop you in 3 new areas. Each of those areas leads to another area. Some of those areas have hidden backdoors to the inverse version of the level you're in, and there's a bevy of puzzles to power up La Mesa. The best part is that there are very little area restrictions outside of a key that you could buy a 5-pack of at any time. You could even use the Stage 1 boss key on any other boss room in the game. You can go anywhere you want and potentially wind up lost or stuck in a pit, and I have indeed seen people get stuck in levels in the game when first starting out. Speedruns often involve ignoring half of the game's content and taking paths that leave many players and even the developers dumbfounded. La-Mulana is the kind of game that will let you bury your nose in a book yet slam the book in your face if you aren't ready for it. In my opinion, it is the quintessential Metroidvania experience. One of the few games to attain true freedom and something game developers should strive for. Conversely, let's compare this to the game I started the video with. Strider 2014 is a game that touts interconnected worlds and the freedom of exploration that comes with Strider and his ability to be a more badass Spider-Man. The moment you're dropped into the game, you're presented with alternative paths, out-of-reach platforms, and alluring secrets. However, by design, Strider is flawed when you try to look beyond the veil of freedom. Level designs are inherently railroaded along certain paths in order to get the power-up or switch necessary to head to the next set of rooms, which repeats this pattern again. Levels are barely interconnected, and even when a branching path is offered, a door requiring a power-up you don't have will impede your way. Many early levels require an array of power-ups that you won't get until much later in the game, and trying to get back to these areas oftentimes becomes a tiring chore. One segment of Strider has a 5-floor gauntlet that will always respawn enemies and block your path, yet this gauntlet is also the only way to another level and holds secrets that require 2 separate power-ups. This all builds up to needless padding of the game, but it also makes me feel like I've been cheated out of my exploration high. I can't go anywhere unless I have permission, and this kills the magic initially. At the very least, Strider does reward you for going out of your way to get secrets, and these secrets enhance the experience of the game. It also makes up for the lack of freedom by having really well-constructed stages and enemy placement. Strider, however, still fails at the cardinal rule of a Metroidvania: let your player base explore. I have a badass cyborg ninja that can climb anything at will. Why can't I crank a simple lever without the shield satellite ability? Naturally, there are other examples of Metroidvanias with true freedom, some often considered a model of how to make games overall, let alone the subgenre. Super Metroid is the obvious example, and with good reason. If La-Mulana is the quintessential Metroidvania experience, then Super Metroid is the core Metroidvania. For the longest time, this game was one of the only games to offer this degree of freedom to its players outside of extremely old or niche relics such as Nightmare 2: The Maze of Gallius. Super Metroid was the first game to offer a huge world to explore and provoke a player's desire to explore it. Much like La-Mulana, you could typically go where you want at any time, levels were deviously interconnected, and progress isn't overly hampered. You only need the Morph Ball, both missiles, both bombs, the charge and ice beams, some health, and the gravity suit to beat Super Metroid. And while the game revolves around getting other power-ups, you can outright skip them. The great thing about Super Metroid, however, is that with the proper amount of skill, a player can outright skip various segments that are usually considered necessary through liberal use of the bomb jump and wall jumps. It rewarded people with the manual skill and reckless behavior to come up with these ideas, and many old school players praise the game to this day because of it. There's a reason why Metroid is part of the Metroidvania genre after all. This game set the gold standard. There are some Metroidvania games out there that allow for freedom for the most part, but still have some soft restrictions on them that impede both new players and experienced ones as well. This semi-freedom feels weird because the ability to do whatever you want still exists, but it feels poorly presented or has a plausible but really tough obstacle to surmount. My primary example of this is the other half of the Metroidvania roots, Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Symphony of the Night is a strange entity from my viewpoint. The game offers a degree of exploratory freedom, but will oftentimes punch you in the shoulder for going off the beaten path. Regular Dracula's Castle has a few areas where you can brute force your way through a tough area, but without the appropriate gear or power, you will burn through a lot of potions in the process. A few parts of regular Castle and many parts of the Upside Down Castle also have areas that are not necessarily barred from passage, but can still intimidate you to take an alternate path. These areas often involve deviously hidden traps or overly strong enemies, and while you could use some powers to trivialize these paths, it's still extremely intimidating. The weirder part is that while Alucard's story is somewhat restrictive in nature, the Maria and Richter alternative modes are insanely free-flowing, and can easily break segments if you have the proper knowledge and dexterity to pull off these outrageous stunts. This is why I find Symphony of the Night to be such an odd entity. The freedom is there, and you're allowed to pursue it, but the game still tries to nudge you in their desired direction as well. Valdis Story is another interesting example of a Metroidvania with quasi-freedom. Being a fairly new game, I was shocked with the amount of leeway I was given. Valdis Story offered branching paths, platforming puzzles, secret areas that could be stubbornly accessed with enough ingenuity, and most importantly, freedom of exploration. Its core gameplay carries everything expected from a Metroidvania, but other design aspects somewhat muddy the experience. One main issue I have with this game is the plot. Being primarily driven by dialogue and context, Valdis Story tends to accidentally trap the player in a certain mindset. Many times the plot will say, go here, do this, and many players will indeed follow instructions without realizing that they could probably take that side path to a new dungeon and maybe get a cool new toy in the process. I actually fell into this mindset myself and lost 3 unlockable allies that were also Kickstarter heroes, which kinda makes me feel bad since I essentially killed off these contributors without even realizing it. Another problem I have with Valdis Story is how it presents itself. In terms of visual design and level design, certain areas do not look like they are explorable or look like level transitions at all. Many side areas and even one plot-centric area can easily be skipped over unless you open up the pause menu map and scrutinize it. It's a form of tunnel vision in a sense, you can barely see the open areas around you. This doesn't directly stop you from going somewhere, but it can potentially make you miss certain areas and wind up being lost for the longest time. These problems didn't stop me from enjoying the game, however, I could see many people missing the side content due to these issues. While we've spent a lot of time discussing games that do Metroidvania's justice, it's about time we discussed examples of the illusion of freedom. As stated before, the main draw for a Metroidvania is non-linear gameplay with an element of tiered progression through unlocks. This combination leads to a drive to explore, and a game should facilitate that player drive. The illusion of freedom, as we defined earlier, is presenting a vast world to explore, yet outright denying the player any right to go outside the pre-designated game path. This can be achieved by stopgaps in the game from either requiring a specific item or power-up, or by the level design itself not facilitating exploration. This illusion is an easy trap to fall into for both developers and consumers, and many gamers mistakenly think a game is a Metroidvania experience when really it's not. A while back in the video I discussed these issues when describing Strider 2014, but let's look at another example of a game that's linear in nature. Cave Story is an indie game that's wildly popular with gamers as a whole, and with good reason. Cave Story has a very charming appeal, great level design, a fun story, and is very refreshing in terms of originality. There's just a slight problem, however. Many consumers claim that Cave Story is a Metroidvania, when in fact it's anything but that. I overly stress that the tenets of a Metroidvania are non-linear gameplay and tiered progression. But when you look at Cave Story, the game has none of these. The game has a set path of levels that, quote, must progress through, and nothing you can do as a player can change this. There's very little branching paths and no interconnected levels, and progress is marked by boss fights rather than exploration. While the game does let you go back to a stage after you clear it, there's really no need to since the average player can get everything in an area without even thinking about it. The game is extremely linear, and the only true fork in the road is if you decide to get the Booster 2.0 for Hell, rather than fall for the trap that the game tricks you into for the Booster 0.8. You can get alternative weapons, but none of them have any non-combat utility outside of the snake, and that thing only shines in Hell. All the design choices for Cave Story make it a great game, just not a Metroidvania in the slightest. If anything, it feels more like an action platformer akin to Contra or Metal Slug. Another game that wears the veil of freedom but doesn't deliver is Unepic. On paper, this game should do everything right with the Metroidvania genre. It offers a huge castle to explore with branching paths, full customization with your character build to facilitate alternative segments and utilities, and tiered areas requiring a specific magic in order to progress. However, in practice, Unepic does nothing correctly and somehow winds up railroading the player along a set path. While there's exploration in each level, there's no branching paths or interconnected levels at all. Just a single hub world with a different path to take to each area, but no mingling among them. You're always going to be doing the same path in Unepic, which involves getting a specific magic and beating a boss to unlock the next area to do the same thing 8 times over. While character development seems cool, there's really no utility to it. Weapons have no alternative use outside of combat, and if you somehow build into the wrong weapon for an enemy, then you have the magic elemental wheel to fall back onto. Unepic wanted to be a Metroidvania-style game, but it wound up being painfully linear, which sucks because I actually like what they did for the core combat mechanics of the game. Since we're talking about Metroidvanias, it would be somewhat silly to not discuss another Metroid game, more specifically one that broke the comfortable trend the series had going. Metroid Fusion for the GBA was a weird foray into the Metroid series. It had all the same core mechanics from the past games like Super Metroid, but there's one slight problem. The game is ridiculously straightforward, and there's a distinct reason why. Metroid Fusion was Nintendo's first experiment with trying to shoehorn plot into the Metroid franchise, and while this was somewhat intriguing, it also wound up perverting the game model. Through the entire game of Metroid Fusion, you are set on rails. The ship AI known as Adam dictates where you're supposed to go, and each level has a subsequent power-up that you can gain for the next area Adam wants you to go to. None of the areas are interconnected, and even backtracking is fixed by the whims of Adam and his totalitarian regime. Many times you'll see the famous red or green doors and think, man, I bet I could find another way in there, only to find that you absolutely need to progress a plot segment that you won't get to for a good while. Probably the worst part is that all these problems stem from Adam in the story, yet across every Metroid game before this we've had no pre-established concept of who this guy is in the first place. Essentially, the very character of Adam was an ass pull out of nowhere to flesh out the game, when in reality it only served to hamper it. Metroid Fusion is probably the worst case of feigned freedom by far, barring what it did to the Metroid franchise overall. Now, while we've spent all this time talking about clear-cut examples, I'd like to finish up the video with an interesting gray area in terms of non-linear exploration. Dark Souls is a weird entity, mainly because it exhibits all the makings of what should be a Metroidvania, but technically it's not one. Dark Souls is primarily an action-adventure game, but there's this weird mix of freedom and restrictions alongside it. As a primary example, let's take a look at when a player first enters Firelink Shrine. Upon entry, you have a selection of areas you could go to: the Undead Parish, a nondescript graveyard, and New Londo. From these areas, you could go to other areas if you possess the know-how, but the requirements are fairly ludicrous. The graveyard leads into the catacombs and is entirely optional for the most part, but the aggressive nature of the enemies alongside the bevy of different mechanics can easily overwhelm new players and low-level challengers alike. New Londo can lead to both Blighttown and Darkroot Forest, but the means to do so are impossible to figure out without a guide, and the residents of New Londo require a specific item or status effect to slay. These are essentially soft lock segments, and both are easily surmountable if you're a coward with the Master Key. From the start, Dark Souls has a lot of shortcuts and sequence breaks that facilitate easy backtracking and allow more skilled players to skip various segments of the game, which is a pleasant surprise compared to the more linear Demon Souls before it. An unusual side effect of the game's design, however, is that it's very clear how the developers intended the game to be played through things like enemy and trap placement. The game also has several hard lock segments where you cannot progress unless you do something specific, as demonstrated by this handy diagram I have here. While it may lack traditional tiered exploration or power-ups to seek, Dark Souls' foray into non-linear gameplay was something interesting and refreshing to see. Had they not opted for a more RPG-centered game model, I could easily see this being a 3D Symphony of the Night in a sense. Now keep in mind that the examples I listed today are not bad games at all, they just feel somewhat restrictive by nature, and that's something I feel is somewhat of a shame. Sure, players might get lost and frustrated, but that's one of the beauties of gaming that I feel we've lost in this current generation of games. Exploration-based games like the Metroidvania pseudo-genre show us the fun in getting lost and applying ourselves to survive and succeed. And piling on unnecessary signposts and restrictions makes us miss the subtle pleasures of the game for what's presented in front of us. Should this fan genre get more headway in the future, I can only hope developers avoid the mistakes I outlined today and allow their consumers more freedom to roam around and get lost. Sometimes it's good to get lost, because then you find experiences that you can look back on and laugh fondly at.